as a Law and Order fan, do I have Law and Order fans in the room? Okay, all right. I actually wanted to be a lawyer until I realized that cases really aren't solved in an hour. But like me, our next speaker, Brenda Wineapple, is fascinated by courtroom dramas, and she's the author of Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation. The New York Times Book Review called it history at its most delicious. Her other books include The Dream of a Just Nation and Ecstatic Nation, Confidence, Crisis, and Compromise, 1848 to 1877. Now, both were named Best Books of the Year by the New York Times, and she was recently named a Fellow of the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers, and is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So please welcome fellow history buff and trial enthusiast, Brenda Wineapple.
Hi, is it a little warmer in here? We'll see. I'm shaking already. First of all, I want to thank everyone here. What a wonderful group. I'm so proud to be part of it. I want to especially thank Robin and Annie and Sadie Pattinson, whom I haven't even seen yet, but we emailed so many times. She made so many things possible. And all of the earlier excellent speakers. It's very hard not just to be postprandial, but also to follow such excellent presentations that you all enjoyed, I'm sure. Interestingly enough, last night I dreamt that Congress was conducting an investigation into the theory of evolution. Or at least I think it was a dream. I'm not quite sure about that. And one of the things I was wondering about, whether it was true or not just that, but why would they care? And I always wonder about that whenever I begin a book. And, you know, my last book was actually called The Impeachers. It was about the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson in 1868, which was the first ever presidential impeachment trial in the United States. And it had always been dismissed as a farce, as an embarrassment, as something that we should completely forget. And when I was studying history as a kid and was writing about it much later, I realized I didn't know anything about it. And I thought, you know, as a fairly well-educated person, how can that be? It happened just a couple years after the first ever presidential assassination, and certainly after the horrific Civil War. And so as I looked into it, and I wanted to look into it, because as I said, it bothered me that I didn't know anything about it. And one of the things that I came across, which was so powerful, was that the senator, from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, when he was talking about the trial and the fact that Andrew Johnson was acquitted, and he was pushing against that, he said the impeachment trial is the last great battle with slavery, which is really quite astonishing, and I think begins to make clear why it is in some ways we didn't know about it, or I didn't know about it. And I came to the question of the Scopes trial with similar kinds of questions. Was it really a circus, or to what extent was it a circus? Certainly media hyped it in that particular way, and especially it seemed to me odd that in 1925, you know, why was the conflict between science and religion, if that's what it was, why was it occurring then, especially since hardly anyone really understood what the science was? And Bertha Vasquez talked, I think, quite eloquently about that this morning when she's talking about people being afraid of what they don't understand. And certainly I think that was true then, and that's true now as well. And what I began to wonder, as in the case of the impeachment trial, was were there other issues at play here? which we can't hear, the kinds of things that we call today dog whistles, I suppose. And my task always, as I conceive of it, and because it's the way I'm interested in things, is to kind of widen the window on what's going on. And so I was really asking myself, what is this trial about? Why was it considered the so-called trial of the century, as I think Ed Larson or someone said this morning, even before the trial began? And you know, that to me is interesting in and of itself, because trials of the century, I know they sell newspapers, but when you think about them, whether it was, you know, O.J. Simpson or the Rosenbergs or the Scottsboro Boys or, you know, other trials of the centuries, Sacco and Vanzetti, those were about immigration or anarchism or treason or terrorism or race. So what was this trial about, really, in that sense, to elevate it in that way? And I began to think, well, isn't when it occurred important? Of course it is in that sense. And it was in the smack middle of the 1920s, which we know. And that was a time of, you know, many times are times of change, but when you consider some of the things that were going on, we have prohibition, the amendment passed to have prohibition. Women, for the first time only for 5 years, have the vote. Calvin Coolidge, a great president, was the first president whose inauguration was broadcast on the radio. Radio was relatively new, and it was pervasive. It was the social media of the time. Then you think of the things that were being published in and around 1925. One, for example, it's come up in the news recently in a different context. Hitler's Mein Kampf was published in 1925. Other books as well, but there were things that were going on. You have the rise of fascism over there, and you also have had the Russian Revolution, which sponsored or sort of inaugurated what was called the Red Scare, the Palmer raids, you know, with the rounding up and deporting, actually, of people who were called subversives. Then you have urbanization, as someone was talking about this morning, and an increasing divide, it seemed, between rural and urban populations. You have the rise of the city, and in the cities themselves, especially, the influx of immigrants that was occurring since the 1880s and 1890s. And so as a result, you have crusades for Americanization in the schools and at work, and tremendous amount of xenophobia as a result of that. It's two really astonishing in many ways books that were bestsellers at the time. One was by Madison Grant called The Passing of the Great Race, meaning the white race, and the other was The Rising Tide of Color Against the Worldwide White Supremacy. You know, it was just really astonishing. In the Grant book, Leonardo and Michelangelo were not considered Italian because they couldn't be. They had to be Nordic. That's what the whites were supposed to be. They had to be Nordic. They couldn't be Italian because they were geniuses. And as several people talked about this morning, Chris, certainly vibrant black communities were being massacred. We had the Tulsa massacre horrifically in 1921, just 4 years before the Scopes trial. 1919, earlier than that, was something called the Red Summer, and yet Elaine Locke's anthology, The New Negro, was being published. And in this context, that's where I wanted these first two slides. I don't know how I changed them, but anyway, that's not important, because they're so astonishing to me. Just weeks after the Scopes trial was over in July, this is in August, 46 special railroad cars were chartered by the Ku Klux Klan for its first national parade, when it was somewhere between 25 and 50,000 Klans, men, women, and children, marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. That's astonishing, really, when you think about it, in that sense. But let me back up just for a minute. As you know, obviously, in 1925, the Tennessee State Legislature passed the law, the Butler Law, that we're talking about today, banning the teaching of evolution in the public schools, right? And it did, and I'm going to quote it now, forbid teaching any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man is descended from a lower order of animal. There was no change in how humans looked over time. There was no evolution from lower animals. A bishop in the 18th century calculated that based on the Bible, Oh, okay. Where do I press it, though?
The green button on the
Okay.
top.
The bishop in the 18th century calculated that based on the Bible, the earth was just 6,000 years old. That's all. End of story. Never mind that dinosaur fossils had been discovered even before Darwin published The Origin of Species. Never mind that the theory of evolution, Darwinism as it came to be known, was accepted. Okay, the theory of evolution, that became contested. As again, Bertha mentioned this morning, theory means something very specific. It doesn't mean fiction, the fiction of evolution. Never mind that geologists found evidence that the earth was billions of years old. William Jennings Bryan, a leader in the Democratic Party and the lead prosecutor in the case, as you know from the speech this morning, put it this way: it's better to trust in the rock of ages than to know the age of rocks. The ACLU, which again was also new, it was new, it had only been founded or to come together in 1920. The organization of that ilk had existed before, but the ACLU, as we know it today, was founded in 1920, and they advertised in 2 Tennessee papers, one Chattanooga, that said that the Butler Act violated the First Amendment's guarantee of religious liberty, and so it offered to defend anyone willing to test the Butler Act by breaking it. And that's where we have, of course, well, that's where we have the Ku Klux Klan. Not really. That's where we have, isn't that awful? Isn't that really amazing? That's where we have, of course, John Scopes, who said, when he was asked to do this, and he consented, he said, you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. And besides, this is one of the things I like the best, well, so many things to like. He was using a textbook authorized, ironically, by the state of Tennessee. All right, it said nothing about divine creation or the Bible. It merely said that evolution was change. And that's where all the commotion began, because now that the ACLU was defending John Scopes, the World Christian Fundamentals Association, which claimed that the Bible must be read literally, all right, hired Bryan, who was more than willing, is the voice of fundamentalism, which he was, because he believed, as they did, all right, and as others did. Other sort of pre-televangelists like Billy Sunday, very popular in 1925, who was going to punch on stage the devil, and Amy Semple McPherson, who founded the Angelus Temple in California, and then was really, had her own radio station, all right? All of these people believed that evolution was the creation of the devil and that a godless intellectual elite was grooming children to become atheists. Now, let me step back for a second also about Bryan. He had been and was a real progressive. And I think it's important, from my point of view anyway, to understand the complexity here, because it gives us, I think, one of the windows that perhaps we need into today. He was nicknamed the Great Commoner. He spoke for the forgotten, the poor, the plain, and anyone left out of an increasingly corporate America. He stood for the people, he said, against the plutocrats, hence he was named the commoner. He had his own newspaper, and for sure he would have been, I think as Leanne said, he would have been a tremendous tweeter. He was, in fact, nominated 3 times for president on the Democratic ticket. He did represent the progressive wing of the Democrats, and in fact, when there was a statue of Bryan put in Washington, D.C., it's no longer there, it was moved. FDR was at the unveiling and hailed Bryan as a progressive. FDR had known Bryan previously, just briefly. This is very interesting. As Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson put him in the cabinet because Bryan was so popular and so powerful that Wilson felt that he was better within the government than outside. He was dangerous in that way. But Bryan quit or resigned from the cabinet in protest against Wilson not being neutral and favoring the British in the run-up to World War I, which he was against at the time. After World War I, which he supported, and he continued to support Wilson, after World War I, he was horrified by the incomprehensible, needless slaughter caused by such new weapons as mustard gas and aerial bombing, which he saw as the fruit of the intellectual and elite, as I said, and the scientists, and of course, of Darwinism. Now, he's confusing, as many people did, and we see some other confusions upcoming. He was confusing science and technology, which is in some ways easy to do. But therefore, and that's why he felt in so many ways that Christianity was under attack, and without Christianity, you have no more moral center, and that's what's important, and that's exactly what was lost in World War I and the run-up to World War I. So he went to, as you can see, he went to Tennessee wearing his pith helmet from the heat, in a sense. As soon as Clarence Darrow heard that Bryan was going to be prosecuting Scopes, he wanted to be part of the action. He hated Bryan. He had been not only at the 1896 convention that elected Bryan or put Bryan on the ticket, the Democratic ticket, he also was in Bryan's camp. They were both progressives. They later parted company. You may know, and of course I'm sure you know, that Darrow was called the attorney for the damned. He was a humanist. He was a champion of civil rights, free thought, and the oppressed. He had been a labor lawyer for many years. And I think it's also important to remember that conservatives considered him dangerous and radical. Idealists considered him crooked. So on both ends, they weren't so pleased with him. And even the ACLU was wary. The ACLU had to have Darrow on the defense because Scopes wanted him. The ACLU didn't want him because he was so unpredictable in so many ways. They thought him too radical. And when the case went before the Tennessee Supreme Court, as the ACLU wanted it to do, to get it to the U.S. Supreme Court, they wanted to dump Darrow. They wanted to drop him. They weren't able to. Now, in this case, for this conference, it's also important to underline that Darrow was a very outspoken agnostic who said that everyone had the right to worship personally, or whatever they wanted to worship. Personally, he didn't believe in God, though he'd be happy to be proved otherwise, but not believing was his right. As early as 1903, he said there was nothing wrong with marriage between the races. Right after the Scopes trial, he took the case of a black family which was accused of murder because they had defended their house against a group of white supremacists, a mob that had come with armed and began shooting at them. Someone was killed, a member of the mob. Darrow pleaded the case before an all-white jury, all-white male jury, of course, and the men accused were acquitted, which was remarkable in 1925 in Detroit. Just before the trial, he also defended Leopold and Loeb, the two teenagers who killed a third teenager just because they thought that they could. They thought they were Nietzsche and Superman. They decided on doing or performing the perfect crime. They admitted they were guilty. Darrow defended them not because he thought they were innocent, which of course they weren't, but because he so loathed capital punishment. And in fact, he did save them from execution. He had, at the same time, as you can guess from Leopold and Loeb or from the Detroit case, he was a real operator in the courtroom. He knew how to speak to juries. He had no trouble at all using newspaper publicity and public opinion when it suited him. He was also, and this is important too when you talk about the complexity of different people, he was also put on trial twice for attempting to bribe a juror. So you have these two rock stars in Tennessee. You have about 200 journalists, camera people, spectators, all coming to Dayton, Tennessee. You have hot dog stands set up. You have lemonade stands set up. You have jewelry stores that are featuring monkey watch fobs, and several of the stores are selling toy cotton monkeys. And I think there's Darrow, here are a bunch of girls holding their cotton monkey dolls. Obviously, you have other kinds of circus-like atmosphere. A sign in the window of a butcher shop declared they handled all kinds of meat except monkey. The local drugstore offered a drink called Monkey Fizz. The proprietor, I think you saw this slide last night, of a dry goods store whose name happened to be Darwin, suspended a scarlet banner on his storefront to advertise that Darwin was right inside. At the railroad junction, the brakemen on passing trains would holler out, "All out for Monkeyville." One attorney on the defense turned to another and said, "This is 20th century America?" So, still, what is at stake here? For one thing, as I mentioned about Bryan's confusion, he was confusing Darwinism, which is to say the theory of evolution, with so-called social Darwinism, which was popularly understood as the survival of the fittest, a concept, popular concepts promulgated by a man named Herbert Spencer. But social Darwinism was not Darwinism, and for that matter, wasn't particularly scientific. To Bryan, though, Darwinism meant social Darwinism, which was to say that the strong exploit the weak, right, and that only the fit deserve to survive, survival of the fittest, right, which he understood to be kind of moral injunction. And that, to him, was a system, understandably, where he said, under which a few supposedly, again, superior intellects, self-appointed, would direct the mating and movements of mankind. But really, end of quote, but really what he was talking about was eugenics, not evolution. Eugenics. The American Eugenics Society, founded in 1921, called for the sterilization of 10% of the United States population to prevent, as they said, the suicide of the white race. That's one of the things he's protesting. I mean, this is what makes the series of issues complicated and interesting in this particular way. Obviously, eugenics had nothing to do with evolution, had nothing to do with Darwin, and it had nothing to do with science, right? It's what's called today, I think, joint science. For as you all know better than I do, especially evolutionary biologists here, evolution basically said that all living things were linked and that over long periods of time they'd evolved from far earlier organisms in a slowly changing drama. Random biological mutations in a species would cause new characteristics to develop, and some of these characteristics could offer an advantage for that species' survival. It didn't mean one species or one group was morally or ethically better than another, and it did not sanction might makes right or the making of poison gas. But to Brian, we're all made in God's image. We could never be descended anything from anything except God directly, right? And he said he therefore deplored the hypothesis, that's what he called a theory, that links man to the lower forms of life and makes him a lineal descendant to the brute, which made his chief concern, he said, protecting man from the demoralization involved in accepting a brute ancestry. Shall school children, this is Brian again, be detached from the throne of God and be compelled to link their ancestors with the jungle? So Brian's understanding, or rather misunderstanding of Darwin, got him so upset that he would scream out, this actually happened during the trial, that he wasn't a mammal. I think you had to be there. Now, this is interesting. This is interesting because I feel sometimes when we're talking about something 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 2,000 years ago, whenever it happens to be, we lose the context. We fail to be able to see the subtext. We don't hear everything that's going on, and we don't understand how one thing is a proxy issue for another. If you, for example, came from Mars or from 100 years from now, I don't know. Would you take, if you still look at front pages of newspapers, if you see them print, I guess you have to see it online, would you be able to connect, say, Stephen Colbert and Jeffrey Epstein and the Texas flood victims and the Superman movie? That's all pretty much on a front page. And you think, if you were coming 100 years, you think, what is this culture about? You know, what connects these kinds of things? That's how I looked at the 19th century. You know, what's a relationship between, say, the Mormons in going to Utah and Stephen Douglas, the Douglas-Lincoln debates? There's some connection there. And there was some connection here. And so that when Brian saying that Darwin's theory of evolution suggested that if humans were descended from monkeys or a brute ancestry, which of course Darwin never said, then what he's objecting to, what he's hearing, is that what's scary is that all humans, white and black and brown, were related, and racial categories are illusory. That is, that evolution, the theory of evolution, helped make indefensible the notion that racial hierarchies could be fixed, separate, and consigned to hierarchies of superior and inferior. There was no hierarchy. As the Harvard geologist Curtly Mather, who went to Dayton to testify and who taught Sunday school outside of Boston, he said the discovery of bones, to give one example, and now I'm quoting him, linked together the white, yellow, and brown and red races. That meant that the vaunted superiority of the so-called Nordics was a fiction, which means, I think, that we should take another look, or a different kind of look, at Dayton and what H.L. Mencken, the journalist, as somebody said, played by Gene Kelly. I was going to say Gene Autry, but in any event, the same difference, really. You know, you have to begin to wonder about those monkey jokes and cartoons and monkey trinkets and dressed up chimps on the sidewalks of Dayton. What are they suggesting? You know, there's a kind of racism implicit in much of the anger that the evolution had caused. Unsurprisingly, Brian praised segregation. This guy was actually not at the trial, but on the street. That's what they brought to Dayton. Bryan praised segregation and voting restrictions. These restrictions were a matter of necessity, he said, to the welfare of the white South. He'd moved to Florida. He was hoping to get elected senator, which he called the more advanced race, and which, according to him, must stay in power, not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit, as he put it, of the backward race. Also, I'm quoting him directly. In a 1924 speech before the Democratic National Convention, the sternest language he'd use against the Klan, because people at the convention wanted to censure the Klan, who were there, by the way, and they were in the governorships and state houses and so forth. The strongest language he would use against him was to call the group misguided. Maybe Bryan and the Solid South would have felt better about everything if Darwin had said donkey instead of monkey, the New Yorker magazine quipped. The New Yorker magazine started in 1925, too. But the journalist and educator William Pickens, the black journalist and educator William Pickens, was more direct. The law of evolution, he said, he wrote, cannot be overthrown by the wisdom of a state where they burn men alive. This is one of the cartoons you see in black papers. Joe, do you believe friends like those are descendants of ours? Fiends like those? No. All right. So when Darrow drilled down, asking Bryan if he knew there were other ancient religions in addition to the Jewish religion that described the flood, Bryan said he had not examined other religions, right? He said that the Christian religion had satisfied me. And that's why, in some sense, Darrow was at the trial. Because to Darrow, the issue was that Bryan hoped to turn the country into a bigoted theocracy where one, and only one version of the Bible could be taught. One, only one, a literalist one, and where academic freedom would be destroyed, where science could be outlawed, where civil rights would be denied, where prejudice and ignorance would replace liberty and learning. So he wanted to try the case in the public and in the newspapers. There you have them. You've seen them a lot, right, in this particular sense. But the scientists who had come, I mentioned one of them, 7 scientists who had come to Dayton were denied the opportunity to address the jury and explain what the theory of evolution meant. And that's when Bryan was put on the stand by Darrow, sort of a real sort of unlawyerly kind of thing to do, and that's where Darrow began his queries, his interrogation of Bryan in the kinds of questions about, do you really believe Joshua made the sun stand still? Did you know what would happen to the earth if the sun stood still? Bryan said, yes, I believe it. The Bible said so. I accept the Bible absolutely. All right? And again, Darrow asked more questions. He turned to the story of Noah and the flood. When did it occur? Bryan said it wasn't his concern, adding, I do not think about the things I do not think about. Darrow said, do you think about the things you do think about? Darrow asked him, as I said, about various religions. All right, what about the religions of Confucius or Buddha? I think they're very inferior, Bryan replied. And eventually, as you heard this morning, Darrow asked about the creation of the earth in 6 days. What did Bryan think the morning and the evening or the second day meant? I do not think it necessarily means a 24-hour day. I do not see there's any necessity for constructing the words the evening and the morning as meaning a 24-hour day. Darrow dug in. Do you think those weren't literal days? I do not think they were 24-hour days. My impression was they were periods. Have you any idea of the length of the periods? Darrow asked. No. Do you think the sun was made on the 4th day? Yes. And they had the morning and the evening without the sun? Bryan said, I believe in creation as they're told in the Bible, and if I'm not able to explain it, I will accept it. Brian knew what was happening. And the two men went back and forth until Darrow was completely satisfied that he'd made his point plain, that Brian had blundered badly, that he was not the literalist he pretended to be, right? Brian could not extricate himself, right? And that was that. I think watching this trial outside, everyone had gone outside. It was so hot in the courtroom, so many people, not like it was actually got warmer in here, but so many people there in that hot courtroom, no air conditioning, right, with the camera equipment, that the floor began to give way, all right, and the judge was afraid the floor would collapse. They all had gone outside, and seeing these two men on the kind of scaffold that had been set up, the witness stand, go at it and get more and more angry and watch really Brian melt down in many ways. It must have been really painful, terrible. And of course, Brian was humiliated, right, in this sense. But, and I think I'm just trying to suggest this before, and this is important, that both Brian and Darrow placed their faith in democracy. To Brian, democracy meant majority rule and states' rights. If the people in each state should decide for themselves, for instance, what should be taught in state-supported schools. That meant, if taken to its logical conclusion, that if the people voted to keep slavery, then that was okay. This is the irony of Brian's progressive spirit. He was the man who stood by the little people, the neglected, the poor, the weak, the people. The man who insisted that senators be elected directly by the people and not by state legislatures, and that women should be allowed to have the vote. Yet, he was also someone who wanted to force people to believe whatever he believed, by fiat, if necessary. Now, that was his sense of democracy, his definition of it. It's not irrelevant. To Darrow, though, there could be no democracy without reason, which is also to say without education and an informed and educated people. Otherwise, we're left with intolerance and prejudice. No, I'm quoting Darrow now, no subject possesses the minds of men like religious bigotry and hate. And these fires are being lighted in America, he said. Hatred, bigotry, intolerance. You see it there. People knew, I think, very well, in a way that we've lost, and perhaps lost connection with. They knew what this trial really was about in this particular sense. From Darrow's point of view, from many people's point of view, it's certainly, it could be advertised as a circus, but I'm not so sure. I think it's kind of a mistake to think that in these ways, because Darrow was suggesting that the legacy of the Scopes trial would be the legacy of an America where the freedoms enshrined in the Constitution can never be taken for granted. The issue was not whether a scientific theory was right or wrong. Only science could determine that. The issue was democratic tolerance of different points of view. And as he implied, the United States Constitution protects both science and religion, or not having a religion. That's why he wanted the trial covered as widely as possible. Although, as he later recollected, with some sorrow, most of the newspapers treated the whole case as a farce instead of a tragedy. And to him, it was important as a constitutional case, but not a strict constitutional case. There was something tragic about the trial underneath it, something even contradictory about the theory and practice of democracy that was being argued, and that's why in Darrow's closing remarks, he was addressing the future as well as those Dayton jurors of 100 years ago, that ignorance, he said, and fanaticism are ever busy and need feeding. Today's the public school teachers, tomorrow the private. The next day the preachers and the lecturers, the magazines, the books, the newspapers. After a while, it's the setting of man against man and creed against creed, until with flying banners and beating drums, we're marching backward to the glorious ages of the 16th century, when bigots lighted torches to burn men who dared bring intelligence and enlightenment to the human mind. To Darrow, and to us, then, the Scopes case raises issues that are not scientific questions, and in many ways, they're not even religious questions as I see them. They're cultural questions, and they're very much with us today in the way science and religion are manipulated, whether to remove books from libraries or to forbid their being taught in the schools, or in the fight against reproductive rights and access to health care, or in the abrogation of civil rights. They cut to the heart of democracy. And he's been quoted several times today, so I can't not end with the great Black historian W.E.B. Du Bois, as he wrote, "Democracy was on trial. The truth is, Dayton, Tennessee is America." Thank you very much.